Welcome to another edition of AP's Profiles in Christian Living. Today I have a special guest with me, and his name is Dr. Stephen Chavura, formerly at Macquarie University, now at Campion College, as well as numerous other places. Welcome, Stephen. It's great to have you with us.
It's great to be here, Mark. Thank you very much.
Now, Steve, you're somewhat of an expert, really, in political science. You've been lecturing in it for the past 13 or 14 years. Tell us a little bit about Australia's history. In particular, I see that you've brought with you a second edition of J.D. Lang's The Coming Event.
Yeah.
I know you've also been publishing on reason, religion and polity in Australian society.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about the history of the relationship between church and state in the Australian context.
Wow. When the European settlers came over here in 1788, not only did they bring convicts and soldiers, but they brought a British mindset with them. Because we always have to remember that Australians did not settle Australia, the British did. And so they brought over as much of they could in terms of British institutions, and one of those institutions was actually the Church of England.
Yep.
And so, there's a sense in which from 1788 right up until sort of the 1830s, the Church of England was an established church. It was financially funded by the colonial government. Other alternative churches like the Presbyterians and the Baptists and the Catholics got little to no funding. And very early on, convicts were actually forced to go to Church of England services, and Roman Catholic masses were illegal.
Okay.
So quite early on, the Church of England was established. So the model of church-state relations in the very early colony was definitely one of hard establishment.
Okay.
But then, as it became fairly obvious that New South Wales and Van Diemen's Land were not like England, in the sense that England was, for the overwhelming majority of people, Church of Englanders, and so sort of imposing a single church on everyone in England wasn't such a big deal. You had a small minority of Catholics and you did have dissenters, but most people just accepted that the Church of England was the established church in England. It had been established since the 16th century.
Yep.
Whereas in New South Wales and Van Diemen's Land, Presbyterians, who of course had their own established Church of Scotland, Baptists, Roman Catholics, they started asking, well, wait a second, now we get that in England, the Anglican Church is the established church. We get that. But why should it be established here when you've got 50% of people at Church of Englanders, but the rest of the people are a mixture of Catholics and Presbyterians and various forms of dissent? Why are we giving so much money to the Church of England and everyone else is getting basically little to nothing? And so a movement started against favouritism towards the Church of England. And it really sort of comes to a head in 1836 with Governor Burke.
Okay.
And Governor Burke says, you know something, you're right. The Church of England, it makes sense that it's established in England, but in a society that's so pluralistic as sort of New South Wales and Van Diemen's Land, it's a different set of circumstances, and so the institution should be different. And so you might think, oh, he's just going to disestablish the Church of England. But he doesn't quite do that, because this is an age where there is a strong general belief that religion is really socially important. And the idea of completely severing ties between the state and the church is a pretty radical idea for a lot of people, except for a few, and we can talk about those a bit later. And so what Governor Burke does is he says, right, I'm going to establish the major Christian denominations in the sense that I'm going to take £30,000 from the budget of New South Wales and a very large amount also from Van Diemen's Land budget, or the Tasmanian budget, and we're going to pay for half of what it costs to build every church building and pay half the stipend of every clergyman.
Right.
And so what the church-state relationship became, it went from sort of being the establishment of the Church of England to the what was called sort of plural establishment with the 1836 Church Act of Burke. And so what he did was started giving money to the Anglicans, to the Catholics, to the Presbyterians, and to the dissenters who wanted money, he gave money to them. They didn't all want money.
Okay.
And so that sort of brought us into the second phase of church-state relations.
Okay.
And then finally, it became fairly obvious that the funding of the churches was very expensive compared to what it was in England, because you have to remember that if you have a town in England, the government only needs to build one church because they're all Anglican, basically. Whereas in New South Wales, if you have a town and the government says, I'm going to build a church for each denomination, then you wind up having about 3 or 4 churches built. And so it became very, very expensive. But the other thing, Mark, was that there are a lot of people who did not like the idea of the government funding Catholicism.
Okay.
And the great opponent of the church-state nexus was the Presbyterian minister John Dunmore Lang.
Yeah.
And John Dunmore Lang, a remarkable fellow, one of sort of the great Australians of the 19th century. In fact, I think, there was someone, it was either Henry Parkes or it was Manning Clark, the historian, who sort of called J.D. Lang the greatest Australian of the 19th century. He was a very interesting fellow. Presbyterian minister, born in 1799, comes over to the colony of New South Wales in 1823 to be a Presbyterian minister. Starts one of the earliest liberal arts colleges, actually. That's sort of a forgotten fact about J.D. Lang. He actually started a liberal arts college.
Where was that?
It was in Sydney.
Yeah, okay.
But he basically said that we need to get rid of the connection between church and state, meaning that we need to get rid of the financial connection between church and state, because what that will do is it places churches under the control of states, like they were in Europe as far as he was concerned, and it corrupts the churches. And it also, the big thing that Lang really hated was that it was funding Roman Catholicism. And so the origins of what colonialists called the separation of church and state go back to especially figures like J.D. Lang, who really believed that when churches take money from the government, it corrupts the churches. It makes them. It makes ministers apathetic because they're not being paid by the congregation. They've got a guaranteed stipend from the state. So even if they stop believing in the gospel, they're still going to get paid by the state. They'll just find another congregation somewhere. And so Lang just thought, the reason Christianity in Europe has become so degenerate and it's flourishing in America is because America have what he called separated church and state, which means America have severed the funding between the government and the churches. And so that was the third phase of the separation of church and state, and which was defined in terms of cutting the funding to the churches.
And when did that exactly happen?
It happened differently from state to state. And this is the difficult thing about church-state relations or anything in colonial history. Different colonies cut off funding at different points. And so in New South Wales, they cut it off in 1862, whereas it's cut off about 10 years earlier in South Australia, who don't actually have it for that long, and then other states sort of follow. And so that's sort of the third phase of church and state in Australia. So it's an interesting history.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I've heard you talk about broadly the theory of secularization in the Australian context as really being one, if I can broadly put it like this, of non-denominationalism. Can you just explain a little bit more about your thesis?
Yeah, so the idea is that in Australia, the idea of the secular state has changed in meaning over the generations, really since the mid-19th century. The term secular state starts to become used in Australia in from what I can tell, around about the 1850s. Now, you've sort of got the idea of a secular state before that, but the idea of a secular state is essentially the idea of a government or a state which is concerned with people's earthly happiness, with people's earthly well-being, as opposed to, say, what John Calvin thought a state should be. So very famously, John Calvin in section 4, part 20 in his Institutes, that's right, he says, well, the state is not just about protecting our bodies and our property, it's about much greater things. It's even about protecting our souls and making sure that we get to heaven. And so John Calvin did not believe in the separation of church and state. He believed that the state should use its coercive power not just to force people to obey, to honour one another's property rights, but also to force people to go to church.
Now, that's fascinating because you've also written on Thomas Hobbes and John Calvin.
Yes.
You've got a very good article I've read actually on that. This is a controversial question. Is it fair then to describe Calvin's view as theocratic?
Absolutely. Calvin was a theocrat. Definitely. in the sense that he believed that the state should enforce the rules of the church on citizens.
Okay.
Calvin did not believe in a separation of church and state. Now, Calvin was what we might call modern in other ways. I mean, Calvin really disliked absolute monarchy. He was a Republican, actually.
Okay.
And in that sense, his ideas about sort of popular consent and political legitimacy, they actually wound up resonating very much with the world that would come after him. But his ideas on the relationship between church and state were essentially medieval. So he was definitely a theocrat. There's no doubt about it, and that's certainly how he ran Geneva. Now, where were we?
No. Yeah. So just following on from that, you're talking about the word secular is used in the 1850s, but it wasn't until 1862 that church funding got definanced for the churches. So what we're seeing in the Australian context is that we're not seeing an established church being funded anymore from about the 1860s on. But we're seeing a plurality of Christian religion. Yes. So it's not a secular humanist model, as the secular state and the churches. There's one of, maybe we'd call it the distinction between church and state. Is that fair?
That's a very good distinction to make, the distinction between a distinction between church and state and a separation of church and state. And that's a very important thing to make clear. Now, I sort of said that the general definition of a secular state, which is not quite the same as a separation of church and state, we might come back to that later if you like, but a secular state is essentially the notion that the government, its role is to ensure that people honour one another's rights and ensure that their sort of this worldly existence, their secular existence, because the word sort of secular kind of means things of this age, that people are basically flourishing in that respect, flourishing in this life. Now, people in the 19th century and even in the first half of the 20th century certainly saw Australian governments as secular. But here's the thing, Mark. What if people also believed that the best way to ensure that people honour one another's rights, that people are moral to one another, is for them to be Christians? What that means is that Christianity itself and the sort of the state of Christianity in society is something that is potentially very useful, that it is something that's very important for people's secular well-being. See, nowadays we tend to think of Christianity and religion purely in private terms. It's just sort of a matter of one's beliefs and one's relationship with God and maybe one's relationship with other Christians in a church. Whereas in the 19th century and earlier, Christianity was considered a public good. It was something that if Christianity is flourishing among the people,
the whole of society is flourishing.
The whole of society will flourish because Christianity teaches us to be good to one another, to be moral, to be honest. And what kind of society do you think is going to be happier?
Yeah, that's fascinating. I mean, there'd be a little bit controversial, I'm sure, with many because
well, not back then, but today, yes.
I know, but they would have really framed it, wouldn't they, as seeing the gospel and civilization.
Oh yes,
as going hand in hand.
Oh, absolutely. There's an excellent quote from Charles Latrobe from 1843, begging the colonial office to build churches in Port Phillip, which became Victoria. And he's saying, you've got to build churches here because if you don't build churches, we're not going to have civilization because we won't have Christianity.
Wow.
And so there was this strong sense, particularly among the British, that Christianity and civilization go hand in hand. You lose Christianity, then you lose civilization. That was very much part of the British Enlightenment, which is, again, the mindset that comes over here on the First Fleet. It's not an accident that on the First Fleet you also get a chaplain, Richard Johnson, coming over with Bibles and other things. Christianity comes over.
An evangelical chaplain.
An evangelical chaplain. And then the subsequent chaplains tended to be evangelical as well. And that's a fascinating story in itself. Obviously, Stuart Piggin in Australia.
Well, that's who I was just thinking, somebody that you know well and you've worked with.
Yes, a great
his
guy.
Book, Fount of Public Prosperity, argues that the Australian context was very much a religious experiment. It wasn't just a dumping ground for criminals, but it was very much seen as an opportunity to reform the human soul.
Oh, yes.
You agree with his thesis?
Well, I agree with that, because again, that was very much an Enlightenment view as well. I mean, evangelicalism and the Enlightenment have a very, very close relationship, and that's probably something that you're better off talking with Stuart about. And I would just say also that book is co-written by Professor Bob Linder from Kansas State. But yet, a 2-volume history of evangelicalism in Australia, fascinating stuff. But yeah, back to this idea of the secular state. So in the colonial period, and I would even say up to the 1950s and 60s, just because the state was considered secular did not mean that politicians and Australians didn't think that the state shouldn't care about and even cultivate religion, because religion was seen as a necessary means to people's secular well-being. And the same thing was true of the education system.
Okay. Now, I'm fascinated here because I know that you're somewhat really of an expert on Bob Menzies, Australia's longest-serving Prime Minister and also a committed Presbyterian. In fact, you're just about to publish a book on this with a highly prestigious publisher in Australia. Congratulations.
Thank you. Just signing the contract today.
Yeah, it's fantastic. It's great news.
With Greg Maluish, I might say, a professor of history at Wollongong University.
Oh, fantastic. Look, that's fantastic. I'm really looking forward to reading that. But it was Menzies, wasn't it, that really pushed for education and in particular the universities.
Oh, yes.
He was very much likewise coming from a Christian worldview.
Oh, yeah.
And seeing the two going hand in hand.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the book that Greg Maluish and I have just written, and it's about to be published, hopefully this year. It's called The Forgotten Menzies.
Okay.
And the tentative subtitle is The Mind of Australia's Last Puritan. Because what we argue is that to really understand Robert Menzies, to understand what he meant by liberalism, what he meant by conservatism, the best way to understand that is not to go to some textbook of political philosophy and look up the meaning of liberalism, look up the meaning of conservatism. The best way to understand the mind of Robert Menzies is to get into the evangelical / Presbyterian / sort of Britishness mindset that was so much a part of Australian culture. It was pervasive in Australian culture, and it was especially pervasive in the house of Menzies. He grew up essentially always considering himself a Presbyterian, even though for a lot of his early life he went to a Methodist congregation. I have to say he was always a little bit embarrassed that he went to a Methodist church early on. He always considered himself a Presbyterian.
Right.
Yes. But Menzies had this worldview that you don't separate the sacred and the secular. And he gives a very interesting speech on that very topic. The speech is called On Christian Citizenship in a New Era. He gives the speech in around about 1943 at a church in Sydney. And he says, one of the worst things that we do nowadays, and he's talking about the 1940s, is that we separate the sacred from the secular, and we're only Christians on Sundays. And he says, no, this has got to permeate every aspect of our life, every aspect of our thought. Now Menzies was no evangelical, but he certainly had a profound respect for the contribution that Christianity makes, not just to sort of civilization in general, but more particularly to democracy and to education. And for Menzies, if you don't have this Christian idea that all people are created equal and have a sort of spark of the divine in them, then democracy loses all of its theoretical foundations. And he also rejected the idea that you could possibly have an education that did not teach children about their relationship with the Creator, because that's sort of the very foundation of any notion of dignity and rights. Not that Menzies liked talking about rights all that much. He didn't.
Yeah. He talked more about responsibilities.
He spoke more about responsibilities, which is sort of what historians call cultural Puritanism, which was a way of thinking that was very common before World War II. So before World War II, when things are scarce, when times are tough, and evangelicalism is very bound up with this as well, the moral emphasis in societies is on responsibilities. So the good life is a life where you do your duty. That is the good life. Now, with the prosperity of World War II and the immense success of America exporting its culture, that starts to shift and the emphasis starts to become more on rights. And that was something that Menzies always worried about. For Menzies, the great threat to civilization was actually not so much communism, although he did think communism was a great threat because of its godlessness, because of its materialism.
Okay.
But Menzies also thought that another kind of materialism was even more threatening, and that was the materialism of affluence.
Okay.
And what Menzies really worried about was that affluence and relying on science would teach us to become increasingly individualistic, would teach us to become increasingly indifferent to our relationship with one another as citizens, and increasingly indifferent to our relationship with God, which would then sort of go on to undermine democracy.
Now that's very interesting. How much of Menzies' fears do you think were realised?
Yeah, Menzies was completely correct, and all his worst fears came true.
Right.
And one of the, perhaps one of the more controversial aspects of our book, although a friend of mine the other day pointed out that Menzies himself sort of openly admitted this, or at least not openly, but in private letters that he'd written, is that in many ways the things that Menzies most wanted to achieve in his career, which was really, in a sense, I mean, what did Menzies want to achieve? The thesis of our book is that what he wanted to do was reinvigorate cultural Puritanism. That's what he wanted to do. He never used that term.
Okay.
But he was trying to reinvigorate a way of thinking about ourselves as citizens, which he thought was under threat, especially by socialism. And there's a sense in which, if that was Menzies' great ambition, then Menzies' project was basically a failure.
Wow.
And that is the thesis of our book.
Wow.
That when you look around at what Australia is like now, and even
That is...
that really Menzies' worst fears came true, which in a sense is kind of a backhanded compliment because it shows that he was actually quite prophetic.
Well, I could imagine Menzies looking at the state of our universities today and rolling over in his grave.
Well, this is the tragic thing, and Greg, my colleague Greg Maluish has written a lot about this, that the irony about Menzies is that Menzies was the one who was most enthusiastic about universities, who really expanded the universities in the 50s and 60s, poured lots of money into them, which wound up hiring more and more academics. But what started happening at the same time was that radical leftism, Marxism, started creeping into the universities and turning them into the exact opposite of what he hoped they would be. For Menzies, the purpose of a university is to sort of transmit the best of culture from generation to generation. It is meant to identify the greatest ideas of all time, what Matthew Arnold in the 19th century called sweetness and light, identify the greatest thoughts that humankind has ever thought, and to teach them to new generations, generation after generation, and to build upon it. A very traditional idea of a university. And so Menzies thought this is what is crucial to fight communism. This is what is crucial to fight materialism. For Menzies, I mean, this is the thing. For Menzies, the great emphasis was actually not on the church. It was actually on the university, although he was a Christian. There's no doubt in my mind he was a Christian. But, of course, Menzies pours all this money into the universities. Around about the same time, universities are becoming strongly infiltrated by Marxism.
So we've gone from the Church Act of Burke in 1836 to almost the University Acts of Menzies
that's right.
in the 1960s.
Yes.
And tragically, the irony is... here he was, this cultural Puritan, not a theological Puritan, because as you said, he wasn't an evangelical.
No, he wasn't.
But the very state-sponsored program he initiated and drove was the thing that destroyed his own vision.
Yes, the best way to think about the universities were basically, sharper than a serpent's tooth is an ungrateful child. That's really the best way, because Menzies really turned them into what they were.
Wow.
But you'll never hear anything good about Menzies if you even hear about Menzies anymore.
Wow.
So the Menzies wanted universities to perpetuate the best of culture. What universities turned into were institutions that did nothing but critique the very aspects of culture that Menzies thought were most worthy to be held onto, whether that was Britishness, Christianity, individuality, not individualism. Menzies was more about individuality. He believed that we need to stand on our own 2 feet, but not be selfish.
Yeah, there's a fascinating book by David First Roberts.
Yeah, a very good Menzies scholar.
Yeah,
yes,
and he's published a lot of the speeches that Menzies originally gave and thankfully now not been lost.
Yes.
One of them was that I found very interesting was Menzies' idea of merit-based selection for political candidates.
Yes.
He would have been dead against the tokenism of just having certain individuals represented.
Oh yeah, that's right. And this, of course, became a sort of a national debate for a few days. And you wrote one of the best contributions on it regarding quotas for women. And so you had some sort of public commentators. One of them was certainly Julia Baird from memory, and there was another one, I can't remember who it was, who basically said, Menzies stood in favour of quotas for women.
Yeah, when he was
which is
diametrically opposed.
Well, by then I'd been researching Menzies for a few years, and I remember as soon as I saw that, I thought to myself, well, you know something, Menzies was actually pretty progressive when it came to women for his time.
He was.
But I don't remember him ever talking about quotas for women, and he wrote a couple of speeches on women in politics. And of course, you, Mark, wrote probably the best contribution on that with your, I think it was a Spectator article, where you basically went straight to the sources, which is what none of these other commentators had done. And said, well, actually, no, Menzies was against that kind of thing. He wanted women voted in on merit. Menzies was quite progressive when it came to women. And in actual fact, when you look at the rhetoric of the early Liberal Party, as opposed to the Labour Party, the rhetoric of the early Liberal Party is very much about the household, whereas the rhetoric of the Labour Party is very much about the working man.
Okay.
It's not domestic.
That's interesting.
And when you read Menzies' great Forgotten People speech, what was it? About 1942, I think, he talks about homes. It's all about the home.
Yeah.
And that was something that really resonated with women in the 1940s. They really felt that Menzies was talking to them.
They had a champion.
They had a champion. He wasn't just talking to the boys. And consequently, it was actually quite fashionable among women to be pro-Menzies.
Wow.
And so, Menzies is a fascinating figure, but no, he wasn't. He was progressive in his view of women, but he certainly was. He was not what you would call a feminist. He was a meritocrat, if you like.
Okay. Now, just recently, I interviewed James Jeffrey, a young man who's studying at
fine young man.
I know that you're aware of him. Yes. He's currently writing a book himself on how to survive university as a Christian. You have really carved out a career for yourself.
Yeah.
Very difficult, I might add, being a conservative, being a Christian at university.
Well, I might even say impossible, but very difficult,
Well, I often quote you because I remember something you said and it really stuck, that of all the Christians you meet at university, they're all willing to die for Jesus, but very few are willing to look foolish for him.
Yeah, well, I mean, there are a few academics out there who are pretty courageous, and of course there are some courageous university students. But certainly what I noticed and what you noticed, Mark, particularly during the same-sex marriage debate, is that, again, there are a lot of Christians out there who are quite happy to be sort of public Christians, but when it comes to issues that are very, very unpopular among the intellectual elites, they become very timid. They start suggesting that this is not an issue that is worth sort of dying. You don't die on the hill for this issue. That this is not an important issue. It's inevitable. There's no point really kicking up much of a fuss about it. And what I started to notice actually was the very fact that a lot of Christians who are very intelligent, very articulate, and certainly not ashamed to be Christians under normal circumstances, and certainly people who I believe would go to a cross for the Lord. When it came to the same-sex marriage debate, were unusually timid. And often when it came to other things as well, that were sort of just issues like abortion and probably a couple of other issues that were very unpopular among the left intellectual elite, they tended to sort of back down on them. They didn't offer opinions that were pro sort of the what you might call the left-wing point of view, but they kind of suggested that these are things that are not worth their time, or they would tend to be kind of equivocal on them.
Have we, as a church, fallen into Menzies' fear of affluence and respectability?
Well, that's an interesting thing. I think the answer is probably some people in the churches, and I've got this thesis. And this is going to be very unpopular, Now, I'm basically by blood a Baptist.
Okay.
I attend an Anglican church for purposes of upward social mobility. Hasn't worked yet, but I live in hope. But I actually do think that when I was watching the same-sex marriage debate unfold, I noticed when I would go to rallies and when I would just see who was really, really actively speaking out against it, what I noticed was that it was those who historically had been sort of the underclass religiously in Australia who were quite open about their opposition to same-sex marriage. So I noticed that Pentecostal churches tended to be quite active on the same-sex marriage issue, opposed to it.
Okay.
I certainly noticed that the Catholics were. The Catholics were very opposed to it and very openly opposed to it. But I noticed that it took a while for the Anglicans to really become vocally opposed to it in a way that was as vocal as, say, the Catholics and some of the Pentecostal
Okay, and
groups.
so why was that?
Well, my theory was that the Catholics and the Pentecostals have always been a kind of despised cultural minority in Australia. They've never been part of the establishment. And so they don't have this kind of this vestigial, lingering, subconscious memory of being part of the elites, sort of being respectable. Catholics in Australia have never been respectable. Pentecostals in Australia have never been respectable.
Yeah.
Anglicans have historically been respectable.
And even Presbyterians.
Dare I say it, even Presbyterians have been respectable in the past. I know a couple of respectable Presbyterians even today. But I noticed, but the Anglicans, not quite. Anglicans have historically been part of the establishment, and I sort of got to wondering, sort of as a historian, whether the fact that maybe there's a kind of subconscious longing to be part of that establishment again that made the Anglicans a little more hesitant to be very, very vocal about the same-sex marriage issue, particularly, I would say, Anglican intellectuals. And so that was, just as a historian, something that I found very, very interesting, because the fact of the matter is that was an issue that really, I don't want to say tore Australia apart, but gee, you know something, coming out of that period, I think a lot of people are sort of suffering some kind of post-traumatic stress. I mean, what that did.
This is the redefinition of marriage.
The marriage issue. I mean, that was an issue that divided friendships. It was an issue that
divided families.
Look, I think it divided congregations. I know people who left the Anglican Communion because the Sydney Anglicans donated, I think, about $1 million to the cause right at the end. I know people who left the Anglican Communion over that. That was a really traumatic thing in sort of the life of Australia.
It's interesting you say that, if I can just interrupt, because there'd be a lot of people out there that would argue the opposite. They'd say, sky didn't fall in, we've still gone on as we have, but you're saying no. So sociologically, it was traumatic.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think it was. I think that was a period where you basically had the beginnings of sort of widespread cancel culture in Australia during the same-sex marriage.
You'd mark it back to that?
I would mark its really widespread element to the same-sex marriage debate. Now, you did have elements of cancel culture earlier. So Geoffrey Blaney sort of got cancelled at Melbourne University in the mid-1980s because he said Asian immigration is getting a little bit out of control. We need to be very careful about it. No, it was during the same-sex marriage debate where suddenly it actually it was declared harmful and bigoted and hateful to just state the case for traditional marriage. It wasn't like that beforehand. We all remember that in around about 2008, you had people like Julia Gillard, Penny Wong, you had Kevin Rudd, all saying, no, we stand for traditional marriage. That was 12 years ago. It wasn't that long ago. And then all of a sudden, about 10 years later, that becomes not just something that's offensive, but it actually becomes something that people start say is harmful. And so let's just fast forward slightly to the Israel Folau case of 2019? Now, Folau, who of course in round about March 2019 sort of paraphrases the Bible and sort of a whole group of sinners who, if they don't repent, will go to hell, and one of those group of sinners is homosexuals, says Falau. His crime was not that he was offending people. Raelene Castle did not sack him because he was offending people. Peter Fitzsimmons did not rail against him in the media because he was offending people. That was not what people said he did that was wrong. They said that he was harming people. And this, now, if I can tie this back to the notion of the secular state, Mark, Christianity at once upon a time, really up to the 1950s and 60s, was just considered, its moral teachings were considered kind of just common sense. They were considered good morality. But certainly from the later 60s to the 1970s, as notions of morality start to change and the idea of authenticity, being true to yourself, starts to become dominant, and self-esteem start to become dominant, and notions of sexual morality start to change, Christianity goes from being something that is kind of commonsensical morality to actually immoral. And even worse than immoral, it's now at the point where it's actually harmful. And so now what we're sort of seeing is that the Christian and the secular have almost completely separated, in the sense that in the 19th century, Christianity was considered by the secular state and secular education actually a really good thing because it's conducive to the good life. It's conducive to people's happiness.
Now it's seen as antithetical.
Now it's seen as antithetical, and consequently now the secular has no room for the Christian anymore. It wants to get rid of it from its realm. So that's why now you have people saying we've got to get religion out of politics, we've got to get religion out of education.
This is a huge topic, and I've heard you talk about this and lecture on this, about the rise of the modern definition of secularism.
Yes.
So the secularisation historically in Australia was a non-denominationalism.
Yes, it was Christianity. Paradoxically, secular, up until probably the 1950s in Australia, meant Christian.
But then in the 60s, it becomes secular humanist.
Well, yeah, in the 60s, I mean, probably a bit earlier than the 60s, but when people's morals start changing, and when the moral ideas of, I guess what you'd call cultural elites, doctors, psychologists, philosophers, public intellectuals, when they start changing, and they're changing before the 60s, it's just in the 60s it starts to gain a lot more popular traction. And a lot of that goes to technological changes that are taking place in the 50s and 60s. One of them, a central one, is probably the pill.
Yep. Massive.
It's huge. It's absolutely huge.
Well, now you can have sex without having children.
Exactly.
And then with IVF, you can have children without having sex.
That's right. And what that means is that the very definition of marriage changes. Yeah. So marriage goes from being an institution whose grounding is in human nature. We're sexual by our nature, which means we're going to by nature have children. The meaning of marriage changes to something more emotional. And one thing that we forget is that, if you ask someone in the 1950s, Mark, do you think two men should be able to get married? I mean, they would say no. But the main reason why they would say no would probably be because they wouldn't see the point. They'd think it doesn't make sense. Why would two men or two women want to get married? They can't have children together.
Well, it was even Paul Keating that used that argument.
Two blokes and a
poodle
don't make a family.
Yeah,
that's right. I mean, Paul Keating's an interesting fellow. I mean, this is another conversation, but Paul Keating is in many ways one of the last old Labor men, and it's very much after Keating that Labor goes from being what it was, which was principally about class, to something more about woke politics.
Okay.
And of course now, and this is sort of the story of Mark Latham. Mark Latham was sort of born 20 years too late.
Yeah.
Because Mark Latham is an old-style class brawler. That's what he was. But he found himself in a party that was no longer so much the party of old Labor and Whitlam, but the party of sort of modern woke politics. Yeah. And as far as Latham is concerned, the Labor Party abandoned him. He didn't abandon the Labor Party. But I mean, look, we don't want to get sidetracked there.
He's had something of a political renaissance. If I could just go back to something you said before about Julia Gillard, Penny Wong, Kevin Rudd, all supported the traditional Judeo-Christian view of marriage. Yeah. But then almost overnight it seemed it changed. How much do you think the rise of social media, Twitter, Facebook, how much has influenced that? And what I mean, if I can just explain, you're very much an historian, you're an academic, you are well read and you encourage people to read. Have we seen a dumbing down of the national discourse where people have forgotten our history and even have forgotten how to think? Is that one of the reasons why we've seen such a massive shift?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I guess there are a few things there. Have we seen a dumbing down of the national discourse? I think what we've seen is a massive expansion of the national discourse that has taken it outside of established newspapers and media sources and has basically given everyone a voice. And so people sort of say, well, there's no more public debate anymore. That's not true. You do have
There's
public
more
debate.
public debate than ever.
Well,
right?
you've got more public debate than ever, and a lot of it is civil. You still have civil debate. I mean, you still have Q&A. ABC still has Q&A. Now they get one conservative in basically to try and destroy them. But
it's civil.
Look, it's civil. They're not killing one another. But you do still, I believe, have public debate. You have newspapers critiquing ideas. The Sydney Morning Herald critiques ideas. The Australian critiques ideas. But you've also got but in addition to sort of the old school sort of public debate, and John Anderson's conversations are sort of examples of sort of public debate as well. But on top, sort of in addition to that, now you've got social media, which is kind of unleashed. It's got no filter, and it seems to be much more vocal, much louder, and in a way much more influential because there are so many people on it than the old media outlets. And so I think what's happened is not so much that we've lost public debate, is that there's a public debate that's still going on, but no one's hearing it over the noise created by social media.
So it's like social media has created this enormous white noise.
Yes.
And it's just
that's right,
coming through.
And that's exactly right. And the great challenge is how to use social media to cultivate more public debate. And there are actual people doing it. I think actually the right are very good at this. So I went to, if I can say, Mike, I went to the Heterodox Academy Forum in New York City last year in 2009. And this is a forum basically started by leftist progressive American professors to sort of try to bring back freedom of speech in universities. But one thing they pointed out was that many conservative commentators are actually really, really good because they engage with ideas. And they singled out Ben Shapiro, who they probably wouldn't agree with on many things, but they said, someone like Ben Shapiro sort of argues about ideas. You don't have to agree with him, but he doesn't attack the person. He attacks the idea. And the point that I want to make, Mark, is that the great challenge, especially for Christians, is to take this new form of communication and use it better than anyone else, which is, of course, exactly what the Protestants did in the 16th century. We're going through another Gutenberg period. And Protestants really sort of dominated it in the 16th century. They did so well out of it, if I can say.
Now, just on that, I mean, here you are, incredibly well read. John Dunmore Lang, this book, which I thought was fascinating, but really stretched me. I read a fair bit, and I found this a challenging.
It's an academic book,
But I've heard you also say never underestimate the power of the meme.
Oh yeah, the meme. Look, I'm actually a fan of social media. I like social media because, again, it's just a very effective way to get ideas across to millions and millions of people. And so an example I use is so we know that Lutheran ideas spread all around Europe very quickly from 1517 onwards. Within months, Luther could sell 100,000 tracts in a matter of months, and they'd be all around Europe. Now, you've got to ask yourself, were 100,000 people reading these things? And the answer is probably not. We've got to remember this is an age where the overwhelming majority of people cannot read. But what Luther and the Lutherans were brilliant at was pictures. So we forget that Lutheran tracts also came with hilarious wood carvings. And I like to show my students the wood carvings, and for this day they're actually still pretty risque. I can't even really describe them, but if you don't know what the word scatological means at home, look it up. The Lutherans and the Protestants were absolutely brilliant at getting very simple ideas across in picture form.
Yeah, they were.
And it was very, very influential. And the same can be said for someone like John Fox and his Book of Martyrs. I mean, you can write a thick book about the history of martyrdom.
But that came with pictures as well.
It came with pictures. It came with very famous wood carvings. And of course you have, very famous paintings and wood carvings by famous, sort of late Renaissance, early Reformation artists. in Europe. And so social media is another thing that certainly I will say conservatives seem to be brilliant at in social media, is using the meme, using pictures with very, very sort of pithy statements to get ideas across. And you could be very snobbish about it and sort of say, oh, you know, that's not particularly sophisticated argument or anything like that. But, you know...
it's effective.
It's effective, but the thing is, we've got to be very careful about being overly snobbish in the way we choose to communicate, because not everyone out there, you know, has a degree. Not everyone out there has the time to read a lot of books. And, you know, there's more than one way to get a message across. And historically, Christians have done that. And I don't think there's anything wrong with doing it now. But no, social media is something that's potentially very exciting. But also social media, what we're seeing how potentially dangerous social media can be. Because if we didn't have modern social media, the Black Lives Matter movement, the riots in the US would pretty much be nowhere. This is the thing. I mean, social media, what it's done is it's created virtual crowds and virtual mobs. Let me give you an example. So transgender theory. Transgender theory has been around for decades. You look at the work of Judith Butler, published in the 1990s. It's kind of all there. Even go back to some of the work of Foucault in the 70s and the 80s, some of the way, you know, the woke people, sort of the very, very sort of identity politics progressive nowadays that we call woke people. I call it the Great Awakening. These are not new ideas.
Good title for a future book there.
I know. The Great Awakening. Yes, it's mine. Don't steal it.
Trademark.
Yeah, but you know, those ideas had been around for a long time. Luther's ideas had been around for a long time. Dare I say it, since the time of the Apostle Paul and the Lord himself. But what made Luther the man of the moment? Well, he had technology on his side. I mean, there's more to it, of course, than that. But as a historian, you know, you see he had technology on his side. Something that, you know, Jan Hus and John Wycliffe did not have. The same is the case for sort of, you know, modern identity politics. So back to transgenderism.
Okay.
You've had people who felt that they're the opposite sex since time immemorial. You've got emperors who were probably, these days would pass as transgender. But the thing is, for the most part, these people could not talk to one another. They sort of existed in a kind of isolation because there was no mass way to communicate their feelings and their thoughts to one another. Bring the internet, bring social media along, and suddenly one person can talk to 1,000 other people who feel the same way, and what you get is a virtual community. And that is something that is new.
Well, there's a lot of weight to what you're saying, because people have said, historians have said, even at the time of the Apostle Paul, one of the reasons why his writings were so popular is you had Roman roads.
Correct.
You had the Greek language was the lingua franca of the ancient world.
Correct.
There's all of these factors that came in. Look, I could talk to you all day. I want to bring this to a very practical head.
Yes.
We're living through COVID. In fact, people are now joking there is BC, before COVID, and the life that we now live, the new normal. This has been a particular challenge for churches, and in particular for how churches relate to the authority of the state.
Yes.
In America, you've got John MacArthur, who's now taking the state of California to court and suing them for effectively overreach of their authority. If we leave that to one side for the moment and focus on the Australian context, what is your observations on how Australian Christians and their churches have responded during this crisis?
Well, I think overall they've responded admirably. And they were certainly some of the early sort of leaders in wanting people to be really, really cautious for the sake of other people.
Love of neighbour. Love of neighbour,
exactly. I think there's culturally something very interesting going on with COVID.
Okay.
I think it's something that's affecting sort of the secular folk and also Christian folk. And I think what COVID... And I think there are other things culturally going on as well. I think Extinction Rebellion and the climate change issue is part of it. I think Black Lives Matter is part of it. I think COVID is massive in this, is that I think it's actually making people feel something that they haven't felt maybe all their lives, and that is a sense of connectedness with the rest of society. I think what COVID is doing for some people, not everyone, some people sort of... we do live in something of a spiritual vacuum nowadays. People talk about the breakdown of communities, the breakdown of social capital. We've become very atomistic, very individualistic. Rates of loneliness are up, rates of suicide are up. We seem to be in a society where where there doesn't seem to be any greater connection between people. People don't sort of feel like they're part of something big. And you notice that the motto for COVID is "We're all in this together."
Yeah.
And I think that's actually speaking very deeply to a lot of people in sort of a wider secular culture who don't feel connected with anything big. In the old days, you felt connected with the nation. You felt connected with the church.
See, that's fascinating. So you're arguing that the social cohesion that's being produced is this meta-narrative based largely on fear of what COVID could do.
I think it's
realistically.
Based, based on fear. But let me be honest, Mark. I think, and this is a purely descriptive statement I'm about to say. I think a lot of people are loving this. I think a lot of people find this incredibly exciting, incredibly uplifting, because they feel like they are part of a community again. They feel again like they are part of something big, and they feel like they are doing something really meaningful. In other words, they feel like they're kind of saving the world. And I think that's part of the appeal it's part of the appeal of the whole Marvel franchise, which has just exploded. It's huge. The whole thing is sort of saving the world. Everyone, you're a superhero. It's the climate change issue speaks deeply to that need to be a part of something bigger than you and also be a savior. And certainly Black Lives Matter does as well. And also the COVID thing does. And so I guess what I'm saying is that I think as churches and as Christians, we need to be aware that I don't think culturally this is just about a virus. I think that COVID is actually a kind of surrogate for a lot of people of a connection with something bigger than themselves that Christians have found in their understanding and that they are redeemed by Christ and their connection with God, but also their connection with other believers. That is something that I think COVID and other movements are doing for a lot of other people. But the other thing I would just say is that Christians just need to be careful that they don't get too carried away with the COVID movement to the point where they become so enthusiastic for shutdowns and lockdowns that they forget that in actual fact, churches are essential institutions. And I part of me was kind of worried when churches sort of ran headlong to shut down during the lockdown, as though they'd forgotten that in actual fact they are crucial institutions, not just spiritually.
It's very interesting you should say that, because something that's being underreported in the media, it's starting to be reported and acknowledged, but underreported is that suicide rates have skyrocketed during COVID.
This was all predicted by secular think tanks in Sydney University, in the UK. All of these things were predicted. My fear is that Christians sort of kind of forget that, the churches really do actually offer something that is essential in a time like this. They offer truth, and they offer connection with something that is actually real, which is with someone that is actually real, that is God.
There's a transcendent connection, but there's also an immanent connection that they have with one another.
Absolutely, and I would just want Christians I think there are a lot of Christians out there, Mark, who I actually think are very traumatized by the age that we're in. It's in many ways a very anti-biblical Christianity age that we're in, and I think there are a lot of Christians, ministers and just parishioners, who are traumatized by the fact that they feel increasingly alienated from the world. And again, the same-sex marriage debate, I think, was traumatic for that very reason, because it really just brought out so much that the world out there really looks at a lot of biblically minded Christians, not just as eccentric, not even just as wrong, but actually as socially pernicious.
Wow.
And I think there are a lot of Christians just traumatized by this, and they're eager to feel a connection with the wider world.
And the COVID crisis brings that.
Mate, not just the COVID crisis. I think climate change. I think Black Lives Matter. I'm not saying that there is no truth in these movements. Don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying there's no truth in them.
But you're saying there's a unifying effect.
I'm saying there's a unifying effect, and you can pursue them excessively, because what you're actually trying to do is fulfill a need to connect with the wider world.
Fascinating.
That potentially could lead churches down the path of being shut longer than they should be, and sending out a message to the rest of society that they're no more important than a pub.
It's very interesting you say that, because Douglas Murray,
Yes.
himself, an outspoken conservative homosexual in the UK, has written on this in the Spectator UK, just saying how much he misses as a homosexual man the church is being open and talking and preaching about the love of God, and how on a weekend now he drives around to parish churches just to view the buildings and go up to their front doors. And it's almost like this nostalgic longing that he has. Yeah. Now, you're a political scientist, maybe just one last question, and an historian. The last time we probably faced a crisis of this magnitude as a nation, in terms of a pandemic, was in the early 1900s with the Spanish flu, almost exactly 100 years ago.
Yes.
What can we learn from what we went through then that we could learn from today?
Well, look, for the most part, you can learn that things will go back to more normality than not. You know,
this too shall pass.
Yes, this too shall pass. But we won't be unaffected and unchanged by it. But things will generally go back to a kind of normality. And so this is not the apocalypse. This is not the end of the world. Arguably, there's something much bigger around the corner.
Yeah. We know that.
Yeah, well,
Christians.
that's right. Well, absolutely. Sure, yeah. I mean, certainly in the
but we need to reaffirm that, don't
sense. Yeah, I mean, this is not the apocalypse.
But there is one coming.
There is absolutely one coming. And this is, as my late father used to say, all catastrophes are a dress rehearsal for the final day of judgment. And if you think you ought to be ready for the next COVID outbreak, how much more should you be ready for the final day of judgment, and know that you are redeemed only by the blood of our Lord Jesus Christ. Again, another reason why churches really ought to be staying open.
Yeah, great words. Thank you so much. It's Dr. Stephen Chavura has been my guest this morning. We've been talking about church and state, about the relationship between the two historically and to the current day. This has been another edition of AP's Profiles in Christian Living. I hope you've enjoyed this particular episode. Please like and subscribe on the link below. Leave comments. We'd love to hear your questions. I think Steve will be able to read most of them when they come up, and hopefully even respond to more than a few. But again, thanks for joining us, and I hope to see you next time on the show. Thank you.